So back in September of 2018, myself and a team of co-workers were asked to take part in Culture Night. And the theme of the night was Terry Pratchett. And the idea was to kind of come up with a way of putting some of the research that we had done to date on display within the context of fantasy literature. So we've done like a lot of work around entity linking, knowledge-based construction, and information extraction in the context of history. The challenge for us was, well, how do we apply this to a fantasy or fictitious world? So we kind of had two divergent streams of thought, which I'll get to as we proceed. The first was to kind of take note of the fact that Terry Pratchett has a large and extremely active community online, people who are incredibly enthusiastic about his works. And we figured that it should be possible to take advantage of the structure of the L-Space Wiki, for example, to identify people, places, and things that exist within the realm of Discworld, and then teach a computer about those things so that the computer could read the book, identify these entities, and then we could use the computer's awareness of these things to perform different kinds of analysis. So I actually have a little example of how this turned out. We essentially scraped the L-Space Wiki in its entirety. We trained an entity linking system based on it. And the input to the system was the text of a novel, which you can see here. This is the first Terry Pratchett book, The Colour of Magic. And after processing this, the computer is able to indicate that it knows, for example, that magic is a concept within Discworld. There's such a thing as magic. Ankh-Morpork is another thing. It's a city. And we can follow these links back to the L-Space Wiki and read more information about the entity that's been annotated. So here's information about Ankh-Morpork. What this does from a computer science perspective is it introduces consistency into the text of a document. So for example, if we do a search for the broken drum, we can see that the broken drum is actually the same as the mended drum. After it undergoes renovation after a big fire in Ankh-Morpork. So because the computer was now able to read the books and understand their contents, it was possible for us to start doing some interesting things with them. For example, we were able to look at co-occurrence of characters. How often do certain characters co-occur within the books and under what conditions? So let's take, for example, the characters in Going Postal. The colors indicate groupings of characters, and characters which belong to the same grouping get clustered close together. Now, we used k-means clustering for this, which probably wasn't the best choice at the time. The intention was to just highlight that this could be done. In addition to being able to show how characters are grouped, we were able to show how their interactions were distributed across the course of a novel or across the course of multiple novels. So, for example, here in The Amazing Maurice and his Traveling Rodents, we can see on the left-hand side all the characters that occurred in the book and at what points in the book they occurred. So Maurice here is, of course, a pretty major character and is mentioned throughout. Death has just one little appearance here towards the end. What's really interesting is if you actually zoom in on this region, and I know this is probably really hard to see on the video, but you can see here's where Death gets mentioned. There are only two characters whose paths overlap with Death. One is Dangerous Beans, and the other is Maurice down here. And in fact, this is sort of a major moment in the book where these two characters are dead, and they're having a conversation with Death to argue that they should be given another chance. Looking at two sequels then, so we took Going Postal and Making Money. We were able to use the information. We were able to use the information that we'd infused the books with to show how certain characters occurred across both books. So Moist von Lipwick being the main character in both stories, but also, for example, how certain characters drop off. So Reacher Guilt, the antagonist in the first book, only has a line up to here, where the first book ends. We then have new characters who come in for the second book. And I'm blanking a little bit here on camera, but somewhere in there is Cosmo Lavish. There he is. Yeah, that's Cosmo Lavish's path there. So we can see he starts in the second book. There's some really interesting challenges that come out of this as well. So for anyone who's read these books, Cosmo Lavish is obsessed with Reacher Guilt, who is down here. And I don't want to spoil the book in a video, but hey, spoiler upcoming, so be careful. At the end of the book, he essentially loses his mind and comes to believe that he is Reacher Guilt. And there are other characters who refer to him as Reacher Guilt, and so on and so forth. That's really challenging, of course, from an entity linking perspective, because we have to separate mentions of characters where it is genuinely Reacher Guilt from those that are just Cosmo Lavish in moments of madness. So in addition to the clustering work that we did and the distribution of characters across the books, we were also able to generate networks of relationships between characters where it's kind of hard to see here, but the size of a node indicates how often that character was mentioned in the book. So Moist von Lipwig is, of course, central to the novel. And then we were also able to take a measure of strength. It's hard to see on the screen here, but the thicker a line is, the stronger the relationship between two characters. Now, we can filter that a little bit. So let's take, for example, let's filter by degree. Yeah, let's filter by degree. And we'll say, let's only look at characters who have a lot of relationships. So these are characters who are mentioned quite a bit through the novels, or through the novel, and generally in conjunction with one another. So we can see, let me expand that a little bit so it's a bit easier to read. So we can see this kind of network of main characters, Pump, Reacher Guilt, Moist von Lipwig, and we can see how they interact with each other, how they're connected to each other. And as we tweak this filter, we can start to introduce some of the other characters into the graph and see at what point they become sort of important, assuming your definition of important is degree in a graph. All of these little bits and pieces were essentially meant to be an illustration of how once the computer understands who your characters are and can start to identify them in the course of a book, you can start creating different visualizations, whether that's a distribution or a network or clusters. But actually, at this point in the project, one of the team members had a pretty interesting idea that we ran with. The team member noted that Terry Pratchett also published a series of atlases of Discworld. And these atlases were reasonably to scale. They were quite good. So after this team member kind of hid down the back of a conference he was supposed to be attending, he assembled essentially Google Maps for Discworld. So what you're looking at here is not just a static raster image, it's a full GIS tagged map of Discworld that was created using QGIS. We had various challenges that we had to overcome, such as representing a flat planet, a flat Earth as it were, using software that's typically designed to represent a globe. But we can zoom in on different regions of this map, and I'll show you just how far in we can go now in a minute. But because this map is aware of the geography of Discworld, and because of the previous work we did, which was aware of the entities within a novel, it was possible to stitch these two bodies of work together. So it became possible to ask questions like, well, okay, what regions are mentioned in the Colour of Magic? So here's all the different places that are mentioned in the Colour of Magic. We're then able to go a step further and leverage what the computer knows about these places to ask questions about them. So what is Sumtree? Sumtree is a remote exotic island home to strange flora and fauna. The little we know about this island and the sources of information, and then there's more information that follows from that point on. We were able to, one of our team members manually assembled a path across Discworld. So in the novel Witches Abroad, this is the route that the witches take, and all of the major points along that route and what happens to them. So this was, as I mentioned, a manual effort, but again, it just sort of illustrates how a resource like this can be used to provide a new perspective on what is a treasured collection of fantasy works. So just because we have to show off, and I'd feel bad if we didn't, we were able to create a map of Ankh-Morpork as well. You can zoom right in on this and have a look around Ankh-Morpork. The streets are labeled. It's again fully GIS tagged, so tell me where the Unseen University is. We get a little notification there, and I can click on that and read about the Unseen University. Of course, I think I titled this talk, Which Way to the Ankh-Morpork Post Office. So if I didn't answer that in the course of this video, I think I would be egregiously mistaken. So, pork. We'll go, actually, sorry, post office. Should do it. So there's the Ankh-Morpork post office, and we can zoom in on that. And there's a little bit of information about the post office. I'd like to point out that the post office is directly next to Richard Gilt's abode, which is probably why he stuck Moist van Lipwig there in going postal. If there's a point to this little software demo, it's essentially that computers are great for analysis and they're great for organizing information, but they're also a creative medium, and it's possible, once you understand your collection in a certain way, if it's possible to create weird, unusual, previously unseen visualizations that encourage people to engage with them. This map was essentially put together by a person who had an idea and just ran with it. And with support from, say, a community of people who are willing to contribute, it could grow. It becomes possible to make a fictitious world tangible. There's no reason why you couldn't apply, for example, a route mapper to this. So when considering other collections, there are very standard things you can do, very standard forms of analysis, information retrieval, standard text-based search, but you can also provide experiences that are genuinely engaging and really quite beautiful if you start to think about the unique characteristics of your own collection. In this case, the availability of an atlas and a wonderful community online, which allowed us to create multiple different visualizations, which ultimately came together to provide one experience. So thanks very much for watching, and take care.